Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. The channel is dedicated to exploring critical issues in the world. As such, this channel is not afraid to challenge existing facts, beliefs, and practices in order to contribute to the advancement of knowledge. Today's presentation is titled Africa Continues to Suffer from Educational and Religious Colonialism. Decolonization will take 50 to 100 years. Introduction to the topic. After having been educated and socialized to embrace current formal educational systems in Africa, it is probable that a considerable number of educated Africans, especially those in sub-Saharan Africa, are not aware of the colonized nature of education and religion in the continent. Due to the strong desire to receive formal educational training, millions of Africans gladly consume propagandistic educational and religious information that devalue African cultures, religions, and civilizations while reinforcing foreign cultures and religions. Even after the attainment of the so-called independence that seemed to be a mere political gimmick, African countries continue to perpetuate educational curricula that were pioneered by Islamic and Christian missionaries and scholars, educators, and colonial officials. As a result, not much has changed in the continent concerning the educational curricula after about 50 to 60 years of independence for most countries in the continent. The purpose of this presentation is to achieve the following goals. 1. Explore the colonial effects of education and religion in Africa. And 2. Determine whether the colonial impact on education and religion is the reason most educated Africans are not familiar with their indigenous cultures and religions. In order to achieve the goals of the presentation, the following arguments are made. 1. Africans continue to receive education based on the colonial educational curricula. 2. Islam and Christianity spread to most parts of Africa through conquest and colonization. 3. Thus, Africans are educated and socialized to embrace foreign cultures and religions and to devalue their own. 4. Hence, most educated Africans embrace Christianity and Islam and are proficient in reading and understanding the Bible and the Quran while having little or no knowledge of their traditional cultures and religions. Now, let's look at the conquest and spread of Islam in Africa. We're going it step by step. After the Islamic conquest, we look at the Western colonial conquest also. The Islamic religion started to spread in Africa in stages. 1. Islam was initially introduced to Africa through war, resulting in the conquest of Egypt and North Africa. 2. As Islamized Arab traders intermingled with the African people, some Africans voluntarily converted to Islam. This was how Islam was spread to parts of East, Central, and West Africa. Hence, some African rulers freely converted to Islam. They included A. Kosoe, the ruler of Gao Songhai Empire, who converted in 1010 CE. B. Maiume of Kanembonu Empire, who converted in 1085 to 1086 CE. C. Maihu or Maiawa of the Kanembonu Empire, converted also in the 11th century. D. Wajabi ibn Rabis of Takro, converted around 1030 CE and was probably the first African ruler to enforce Islamic law. E. Mansa Uli or Mansa Wale of the Mali Empire converted to Islam and carried out Hajj around 1260 to 1270 CE. F. Mansa Musa of Mali Empire converted to Islam around 1312 or 1337 CE. He went on a pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia in 1324 CE. 2. The raiding and capturing of black Africans started as soon as North Africa was conquered in the 7th CE. An Ethiopian named Bilal or Biraba, who was owned by Abu Bakr, the father-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, was the first African slave captured by the Arab traders or jihadists. Abu Bakr later became the head of the Islamic religion. Now, let's look at the conquest and spread of Islam in Africa. 3. Thus, millions of black Africans were captured and sold as slaves as forced conversion increased the spreading of Islam. In fact, some estimates put the number of black Africans captured as slaves up to 15 to 20 million people. 4. The Islamic jihadists, missionaries, and scholars established Islamic educational centers to educate and socialize black Africans to embrace Islam. 5. Since the purpose of Islamic education was to spread Islam, the educational curriculum did not include African cultures, religions, beliefs, practices, histories, and civilizations. Thus, Africans were educated to reject their cultural heritage and adopt Arab and Islamic beliefs, values, norms, and practices. 6. By the middle of the 19th century, Islamic conquest, colonization, and conversion had been reinforced as those black Africans who happened to exist in the Islamic caliphates became totally Islamized, including northern Nigeria. Now, let's look at the conquest and spread of Christianity in Africa, since we've done with the conquest and spread of Islam in Africa. So let's look at the Christian picture. 1. The Roman Catholic Church declared papal bulls empowering Portugal and Spain to invade, conquer, loot, and enslave non-Christians. And this was done in various ways. A. Pope Nicholas V issued papal bull Dom Diversas on June 18, 1452, authorizing the King of Spain and Portugal to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and other non-Christians in the world. So the Christian Pope basically ordered Spain and Portugal to roam the world, conquer, subjugate and enslave non-Christians. B. Pope Nicholas V issued another papal bull titled Romanus Pontifex of 1455 CE. This bull gave Portugal the exclusive right to invade, plunder, and enslave non-Christians along the West African coastline. It should be noted that Portugal was the first European country to visit West Africa because the Christian Church had given it the right to conquer and enslave the inhabitants of the West African region. C. Then, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull titled Intercetera, which authorized Portugal and Spain to attack, conquer, loot, enslave, and colonize non-Christian territories. The Pope asserts right to colonize, convert, and enslave. 2. Through the instigation of Portugal, the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 was held, in which Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain participated. Thereafter, Africa was carved into colonies. These European countries are responsible for the conquest and colonization of Africa. They also conquer the Islamized states but allowed the Islamic religion to remain. That is why in places like Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Gambia, and so forth, Senegal, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, you have a large population of Muslims that were allowed to practice their religions by the Western European powers. Now, let's look at what conquering powers do after conquest. What do they do after they've conquered? So let's look at some of the tactics they used. It is always the case that before any empire or state or kingdom or nation tries to conquer another state or kingdom or nation, it must develop a strategy. The strategy involves phases of actions. 1. The military phase. 2. The political phase. 3. The economic phase. And 4. The cultural phase. Under the cultural phase, we have education and religious conversion. So, education and religious conversion make up the cultural phase. Now, let's look at 1. The military phase. A. It is under this phase that the military is utilized to physically subdue the intended target of conquest. After succeeding in militarily conquering the victim state or kingdom or nation, the conquering power recruits the fighters of the conquered territory to assist in military occupation of the territory. By recruiting the conquered fighters and citizens as part of the military force of occupation, the recruited fighters become attached to the conquering power. For instance, the Nigerian army, Ghanaian army, and Sierra Leonean army were part of the West African Frontier Force, which the British used to conquer Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and so forth. In fact, this is always the model. Whether you talk about the Roman Empire, you talk about the Chinese Empire, you talk about the British Empire, it is always the same format. You use those you conquer to enlarge your military and to further the conquest. Here you have Islamic jihadists fighting to Islamize Sudan in the 18th century. Here you have African soldiers of the West African Frontier Force. So here the British recruited black Africans into his West African Frontier Force and used them to continue the conquest of West Africa. And for these soldiers, they are just doing their job. They don't even think about the fact that they are helping to conquer their own people. You see, that is how the psychology of conquest works. 2. The political phase. Under the political phase, after the military effort has been completed, the conquering power recruits individuals from the conquered territory to serve as political assistants, translators, administrators, and negotiators. Sometimes they recruit the existing political leaders to help them to rule the people. For instance, the British, Belgians, French, Germans, Portuguese, and Spanish worked with some traditional leaders or recruited new ones to assist them in running the conquered territories. If there are no traditional leaders, they create warrant chiefs to do so. Here again, this is designed to encourage the conquered people to accept and identify with the conquering power in order to stabilize the conquest. Here you have British officials sitting down with traditional African leaders, preferably in Nigeria, and trying to work with them to perpetuate the colonial control of the region. And for the traditional leaders, they don't even think that the British are trying to use them against their own interests. They don't even think like that, you see. Instead, they will be thinking that the British recognizes their authority to be leaders, not knowing that they are being used technically to help perpetuate the subjugation. 3. The economic phase. The conquering power will seize all the important economic resources to enrich itself. At the same time, the conquering power will establish economic activities that bind the conquered people to engage in businesses with the conquering power, thereby ensuring mutual relationship. This enables some of the indigenous economic players who are gaining from the arrangement to end up developing strong economic relationship with the conquering colonial power and begin to fight to sustain the relationship. In fact, Nigeria is using this tactic to gain control of the oil wealth in the Niger Delta south of Nigeria after adopting the plan from the British. Since some personalities in the Niger Delta South are gaining financially from the exploitative relationship between Nigeria and the oil region, they are working with Nigeria to perpetuate the exploitation. This is also the case throughout Africa, where many political rulers and high government officials sign bilateral and multilateral relations with foreign countries and international organizations that exploit Africa. Hence, despite enormous resources in the continent, Africa is still the poorest continent in the world. 4. The cultural phase. The establishment of schools and religious centers. This phase is accomplished through education and religion. Conquering military powers know that military conquest alone cannot sustain the conquest of a people because sooner or later the conquered people will resist militantly by waging wars of liberation thereby bleeding and costing the conquering powers too much money and personnel to subdue the resistance. To avoid fighting a counter-insurgency war to subdue liberation fighters, conquering powers deploy education and religion as cultural instruments to perpetually bind the conquered people with the aspirations of the colonial powers or the conquering powers. Thus, as soon as the political situation is being stabilized, educational and religious officials from the conquering power begin immediately to set up educational and religious centers in order to deprogram the people from their cultural and religious beliefs and practices and reprogram them to embrace the culture and religion of the conquering power, colonial power. This is done to tie the subjects of the conquered state or nation with the cultural and religious traditions of the colonial power. This is also done to reduce resistance to the new order being set up by the colonial power. Setting up a deprogramming education to destroy indigenous cultures and religions. And this is also very common tactic that conquering powers do to destroy the indigenous cultures. Is very important if you want to conquer. In the case of the Islamic states, Islamic missionaries, mullahs, and educators quickly set up educational and religious centers to deprogram the people from their indigenous cultures and religions and encourage them to embrace Islamic education and religion. In the case of Britain, the Christian Missionary Society, dominated by the Anglicans and Presbyterians, quickly set up religious and educational centers in strategic locations to deprogram the people to reject their indigenous cultures and religions. In the cases of Belgian, French, Portuguese, and Spanish colonial powers, the missionaries, priests, and educators of the Roman Catholic Church set up educational and religious centers to convert people to embrace Catholicism. So let's look at the colonial educational curricula. The Islamic missionaries developed an educational curriculum that emphasizes the mastery of Islam, the Arab world, reading and writing. Generally, the Islamic missionaries and educators intentionally omitted subjects in African history, cultures, religions, and civilizations. The purpose of the education was to, and continues to, produce an Islamic personality by getting rid of African cultures and religions. Hence, African children who attended Islamic schools became well educated in Islam and Arab civilization and nothing about African cultures, religions, and civilizations. Here you have an Islamic school in Bamako, Mali in 1992. You see how young black African children are now being educated, trained, and socialized to embrace Islam and to ignore their African cultures and religions. By the time they finish their primary school and their secondary school, they are totally proficient in Islamic knowledge and little or nothing about their traditional African cultures and religions. When the Belgian, British, French, German, Portuguese, and Spanish conquerors succeeded in conquering various African groups, they established colonies. Their Christian missionaries and educators immediately established educational and religious centers to educate, socialize, and deprogram the African people, especially the children. Hence, the educational curricula they established taught reading, writing, arithmetic, Christianity, and the Bible at the primary school level. They avoided teaching anything about African history, culture, religion, and civilizations. Here you have a Christian missionary school where young black African children are being educated. By the time they complete their school, they will be so proficient in understanding everything about Christianity, everything about the Bible, and some knowledge of the Western world, and little or nothing about their African cultures and religions. This is where it starts, the deprogramming and the reprogramming. You see? Now, let's look at the outcome of the colonial educational systems. So, after the Islamic and Christian missionaries and educators have set up their educational and religious centers, what happened? One, thus, since formal education was initiated by Islamic and Christian missionaries and educators, sub-Saharan Africans have basically been educated to embrace Islam and Arab culture and Christianity and Western culture. Consequently, starting from the colonial era and continuing till today, Black Africans are thoroughly educated to master and embrace Islam and Christianity and reject African cultures and religions. 2. This is why, despite the level of education, most educated Africans can recite and quote the Bible and the Quran effortlessly. 3. The colonial educational system is so effective that most educated Africans can argue about the Bible and the Quran as if they wrote the sacred books. 4. Most of them are willing to defend the adopted religions without thinking about the implications. 5. Due to the success of the deprogramming effort of the religious missionaries and educators, a large proportion of educated Africans refer to their indigenous religions as idol worshipping or the worshipping of fetishes. Think about it. Thus, Black Africans are the only people in the world who mock their own indigenous religions, while the Japanese proudly worship their traditional religion. The Indians worship their Hinduism and Buddhism. Native Americans worship their indigenous religions, but Black Africans will refer to their own as idol worshipping. 6. They readily accept the view that indigenous African religions are satanic. 7. Most educated Africans tend to believe that they will go to heaven and meet with God or Allah because they are Christians and Muslims. 8. The educational curricula have not changed even though African countries claim that they are independent states. 9. The educational curricula have not changed because most high-level government officials, politicians, military and police officers, vice chancellors, professors, ministers, government directors, teachers, principles, and so forth were also products of the colonial educational systems. So they do not see the need to change. As a result, they continue to perpetuate the colonially induced educational systems that turn Africans against themselves. 10. Hence, a vast majority of educated African people are most likely to say that they are either Christians or Muslims. 11. This explains why almost all African heads of state are either Christians or Muslims. It is rare to hear of any African head of state who claims to be an ancestralist. 12. The colonial educational systems are responsible for the reason why so many educated Africans have little or no understanding of their traditional cultures, religions, and civilizations. 13. Due to the successful effort in deprogramming educated Africans to reject their own cultures and religions and wholeheartedly embrace Christianity and Islam, African states operate foreign systems while claiming to be independent states. And there are many ways to look at it. A. The territorial boundaries of African states are artificial and do not reflect the African reality. B. The educational systems are borrowed from the colonial masters and Islam. C. The political systems are borrowed from the colonial masters and Islam. D. The judicial systems are borrowed from the West and Islam. The African concept of justice is ignored. F. The religions are foreign to Africa except in Ethiopia and Egypt. It should be noted that Christianity started in Ethiopia and Coptic Egypt even before Europeans adopted the religion. G. The law enforcement systems are borrowed from the West and Islam. H. Lawyers are trained to think and act like Europeans and Arabs. I. There is no originality in the governance structure of African governments. J. African politicians claim to be democrats and constantly call for democracy, but as soon as they get into power, they ignore democracy and behave as if they are monarchs. K. They want to rule forever. L. They want to transfer power to their children and other family members and ignore the fact that their countries are multi-ethnic and multi-religious. Okay, now let's look at the way conquering powers bind the colonized people to adopt the cultures of the conquering powers. In other words, the conquering powers always want to make sure that those conquered adopt their culture. 1. This is why Kenya, Ghana, India, Malaysia, Pakistan, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, Jamaica, Bahamas, and so forth have British traditions, institutions, and educational systems because they were colonized by Britain. 2. Algeria, Benin, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Haiti, French Caledonia, French Guyana, Madagascar, and so forth have French traditions, institutions, and educational system because they were colonized by France. 3. A visit to Angola, Brazil, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Macau creates the feeling that one is in Portugal because they were colonized by the Portuguese. 4. This is why all the territories colonized by Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain adopted Christianity because they were all Christians. 5. All the territories conquered by the Arabs and Turkey adopted Islam. 6. This is why almost all former British colonies are members of the British Commonwealth. 7. This is why almost all former French colonies are members of the Francophone International Organization. 8. Hence, former Portuguese colonies in Africa are members of the Community of Portuguese Language Countries. 9. The cultural binding through education and religion is responsible for why African rulers often fly to the capitals of their former colonial masters to seek solution to their country's problems. 10. The cultural binding is responsible for Nigerians, Ghanaians, Kenyans, Ugandans, Gambians, and so forth visiting London regularly. Cameroonians, Togolese, Ivorians, Algerians, and so forth visiting Paris and Brussels regularly. Angolans and so forth visit Lisbon regularly because those were their colonial masters. So you see how these so-called African states are bonded to their former colonial masters culturally. In conclusion, the following observations are made. 1. Indeed, Africans continue to receive education based on the colonial educational curricula, hence are taught little or nothing about African cultures, African religions, and African history, African philosophies, and African civilizations. 2. Islam and Christianity, which came to most parts of Africa through conquest and colonization, continue to dominate the continent. 3. Thus, Africans are educated and socialized to embrace foreign cultures and religions and to devalue their own cultures and religions. 4. Hence, most educated Africans embrace Christianity and Islam and are proficient in reading and understanding the Bible and the Quran, but have little or no knowledge of their traditional religious cultures. 5. Due to the colonized educational and religious systems, almost all African heads of state embrace religions that came to the continent largely by way of conquest and colonization. 6. Due to colonized education and religion, most African ruling elites send their children to school overseas. 7. They deposit their funds in foreign banks. 8. They patronize foreign hospitals and refuse to build well-equipped hospitals and research medical facilities at home. 9. They do not value the independence of their countries. 10. Anywhere the Indians and Japanese go, they carry their cultures, religions, and heritage with them. 11. Africans tend to hide their cultures, religions, and heritage and claim the cultures and religions of those who conquered them. 12. The fact that Africans reject their own and eagerly accept foreign ways results in the lack of respect for Africa. 13. It will take about 50 to 100 years to decolonize Africa. And 14. When that time comes, the educational curricula will be changed to reflect African cultural perspectives. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. Please do not fail to subscribe to the channel and listen to other very captivating stories. Again, thank you for listening.